Hello, everybody, and welcome. Before we start off with our program for today, I wanted to take a moment to share some sad news that I know might be shocking to many of you. We've recently learned of the passing of Dr. Kimberly Saunders, who is our Associate Dean, Kimberly Saunders, and we're very sad to learn of her recent passing. And we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. And we're going to take a few moments of silence before we begin our program. She was a friend and a mentor and a colleague and a guide to many of us, and we will miss her dearly. So if you'll join me for a brief moment of silence. Okay, thank you, everybody. So welcome and greetings to our students, faculty, staff, community members, and those who are joining us for continuing education credits. Greetings also to Dave and Barbara Thursz joining us today. Welcome to the second event of our Daniel Thursz Social Justice Election Tuesday series, co-sponsored by SWACOS, the Office of Continuing Professional Education, and the Macro Curriculum Committee. We hope that you will join us for our third and final Election Tuesday event to hear from Professor Ming Francis of University of Washington and Harvard Kennedy School Carr Human Rights Fellow for her talk entitled A Year of Reckoning, COVID-19, BLM Protests, and Election 2020. You can sign up for this free event in the same place you signed up for this. I would like to thank my many partners, my partners at SWACOS, the Office of Continuing Professional Education, Macro Faculty, and our Development Office for our collaborative efforts in planning and implementing the Election Tuesday series. I'm also honored and humbled by the opportunity to use my position as Daniel Thursz Distinguished Professor of Social Justice to continue his legacy of social justice work in support of this Tuesday election series. Please read more about Professor Thursz in your program booklet. And of course, my deepest gratitude to our panelists for being here with us today and for the work that they do every day. Although we are now 1 week past Election Day, we know that elections are not one-time events. They involve long-term planning, and they are only part of our complex and multifaceted political process. As social workers, we also know that politics and the political process are inextricably tied to the social, economic, and cultural world. There is much work to do, much work to do. There is a famous saying that comes from the Jewish wisdom literature, Pirkei Avot, that is usually translated as, "You are not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it." This saying is often invoked to help us overcome the sense that the task of social change and working for social justice is overwhelming, or from disengaging by leaving the work to others. This is certainly relevant in these times as our community grapples with the pandemics of racism and COVID-19. All of you are here today, which is a sign of your engagement and hopefully of your optimism for a more equitable future. Reflecting on the efforts of our community to bring about the changes we wish to see underscores another meaning of this phrase that balances our own personal obligation with the notions that our actions are part of a larger collective. This collective includes not only those who work with us, but the people whose work we build on, and those who will come after us. As a value-based profession, social work requires that we remain engaged with social action and that we listen to the groups and communities that we ourselves work with and for. This is what we do today. For our second community-focused event, we have invited longtime leaders from local advocacy groups to share their wisdom on what should be our next steps and how we as a School of Social Work community can contribute to these efforts. I am pleased to introduce the wonderful student leaders who will facilitate today's conversation, whose full bios you can read in your program. Mary Jaleel Lanier, also known as Mary or MJ, is a third-year MSW student with a macro-clinical concentration, specializing in behavioral health with a subspecialization employee assistance programs. They serve as the school's anti-oppression working group and diversity and anti-oppression committee co-chair. Nina Dujikin is service coordinator at the Choice program and UMB MSW student in her advanced year working towards her macro concentration with a specialization in community action and social policy. Mary Jaleel and Nina, please take the floor to introduce our panelists and begin our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Shadama, for that great introduction.
Good evening, everyone. So happy to see everyone here. We're just going to briefly introduce our panelists and then let them speak a little bit more about themselves before we jump into the questions. We have some prepared questions today, and then there'll be a chance for a Q&A section from the audience as well afterwards. And so we can get started with Karen York, who is the CEO of the Job Opportunities Task Force, if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm Karen York, Chief Executive Officer of the Job Opportunities Task Force, a statewide organization based in Baltimore City. And our focus, our mission is to help low-wage workers advance to high-wage jobs. And we do that via 3 core strategies. Program development, we run a pre-apprenticeship construction training program, Project Jumpstart, that's based in East and West Baltimore. We also run the Community Bail Fund for Baltimore City. Our second strategy is public policy advocacy, which I'm sure we'll get into later on in the discussion. And then our third strategy to round out our mission work is research and public education. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
That was going to be a part of my next comment, City Forever. I was trying to just, I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say it right now, City Forever, and then I'll say it again.
Okay. Next, we'd like to introduce Davon Love. If you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, that'd be great.
So my name is Davon Love. I appreciate the invitation to be with you all this evening. Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank that advocates on the public policy interests of Black people. We have a variety of things that we worked on over the years, and I'm sure we get to a lot of that as we get further into the discussion.
And we do have one more panelist, Matt Hill, who will be joining us. He's a little late because he was literally doing his job. So he'll be joining us a little later in the conversation, and we asked them to introduce themselves because it's one thing for somebody to say what you do, but people be messing stuff up, and y'all, can't nobody say what you do better than you. So thank you for that. And we would like to get this panel started with the question that you guys just kind of touched on a bit, but what is the work that your organization does locally in regard to policy and advocacy? And how does the local tie with the larger picture at a state and a national level? And if we could start with Karen, that'd be great.
Sure. So as I mentioned, my organization, we're statewide, but we're based in Baltimore City. And I mentioned we have 3 core strategies that we use to advance our mission of helping low-wage workers advance to high-wage jobs, but we really define ourselves as an advocacy organization. And the reason why is because organizationally, we know that many of the challenges, if not all of the challenges that we find that our community members are having to navigate, that they are the result of policy decisions, very intentional policy decisions. And many times the solution for fixing policy solutions that have been in place very intentionally for decades is a program. And so, while we understand that programs absolutely provide those immediate resources and help individuals as they're trying to navigate along whatever trajectory they're exploring, we also know that a program does not fix everything. And so, when it comes to our advocacy, again, statewide, right? So we are doing a lot of work across the state, but, your question focused on, national and how the local and the state feeds into the national. For JOTF, our focus tends to be on state policy because for Baltimore City, state policy reform is local. As many of you know, and I'm sure Davon will speak to this more, but there are core functions of our government, our local government, where the decisions have to be made in Annapolis, our state capital. And so these are individuals who are not living and working and playing and residing and the like in Baltimore City, but who are making policy decisions on behalf of the residents in Baltimore City. And so for us, when it comes to how do you do both the state and local, we may spend a bit of time at City Hall, but we spend the majority of our time in Annapolis because that statewide policy we see has the most impact, the most immediate impact, the most tangible impact in the lives of residents across the state, but particularly in Baltimore City. Our advocacy focuses on economic justice, right? So we're talking about things like eliminating barriers to high wage employment. We're very intentional about saying our focus is helping low wage workers advance to high wage jobs. It's not just about getting a job. It's about providing individuals with the skills and the opportunities that they can be able to be self-sufficient and move into whatever direction that they see fit. For their lives. And so our work around economic justice is eliminating those barriers, increasing access to whatever opportunity you may find that you are interested in or well qualified for. And then, of course, improving the conditions and outcomes for our workers as they are transitioning into these new positions. Nationally, when it comes to workforce issues, and I think arguably even state issues, economic justice and we're now starting to use the term economic justice, let's be clear, but many times in workforce spaces, we tend to use the term workforce development or labor. And in those spaces, nationally and arguably at the state level, efforts to increase economic opportunities for individuals tend to be viewed through the lens of the larger progressive labor movements and efforts. And so these are the platforms that focus on things like paid leave and livable wages and the like, things, of course, that we absolutely support as an organization, right? Helping low wage workers advance to high wage jobs. But our constituents, our clients, our neighbors, they're saddled with a whole host of barriers where they're not even in place to access something like paid leave, right? They are not in place to the jobs that are available to them. Because of all of the barriers that they're having to navigate that have nothing to do with workforce, have everything to do with race and place, nothing to do with workforce, but impacting their ability to be and to secure and maintain employment. They are saddled with a ton of these barriers that make it less likely for them to be able to access jobs that provide things like paid sick days and paid leave. And so, our goal is to connect the dots, right? Because many times, as I just mentioned, those platforms tend to conflate many of the issues or reflect the workforce as if it's a monolith, not recognizing that there are many segments of the workforce, many segments of our working population that are relegated to low wage, no wage worker status. Again, because of nothing that necessarily has anything to do with workforce, but has everything to do with race and place. And so, that's why we were so focused on our criminalization of poverty work. This idea that individuals are lacking access to employment because of their interaction with the criminal justice system, not because they're out here just, wilding and, committing a whole bunch of crimes, but literally because they're poor. They cannot meet the financial demands of the law. So whether it's motor vehicle malfunctions that, may start with a repair order that lead all the way up to fines and fees that could end with incarceration, punitive child support enforcement policies that lead to driver's license suspension, which is a real thing in workforce. You got to have a license in the absence of an efficient, accessible, affordable mass transit system. that wages garnished and worst case scenario incarceration, the fines and fees that come with criminal justice debt, all of these things that, actually make it difficult for folks to obtain and secure employment. Those are the things that my organization tend to focus on at the policy level, because we see that the elimination of those barriers or the propping up of policies that facilitate improved outcomes and conditions for our low wage workers, we see the most immediate tangible results.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining what a little bit of what you all do to us. Matt, thank you for joining us. In the name of anti-racism, we are going to let Davon answer the question first, and then we will have you introduce yourself and answer the first question. And I could repeat it before you go if you wanted me to repeat it out loud. Nice to meet you.
All right. So I'm going to start with the end of your question and work backwards to drill down to the specifics, because I think it's really important that we have we situate this in a conceptual frame. The project of European domination of the world is something that is ubiquitous. It's every aspect of civil society is governed based off of that. And when we talk about, what some people call the Middle Passage, other people call the slave trade, other people call, the Ma'afa. When we talk about the project of European domination of the world and the way that it impacts every aspect of our society, we should see the Ma'afa as an act of war against the humanity of peoples of African descent. And that's particularly important because I think too many of us are socialized to believe that that white supremacy is an aberration in American civil society as opposed to, as Derek Bell describes, being a permanent feature of American civil society, white supremacy is part of the engine that fuels the society as it's currently constituted. And so with that in mind, when you think about the history of Black freedom struggle and resistance to European colonialism and white supremacy, we see a tradition, that I'm particularly an extension of, and LBS is an extension of, challenging the system of white supremacy through the lens of understanding that it is through peoples of African descent having sovereignty over the institutions that govern our lives as the basis for our efforts towards liberation, right? That we are under no illusions that, America is going to be less racist towards Black people, and that, we're in a position where we can rely on the benevolence of people outside of our community. We're very clear that any freedom that Black people will attain will be attained through the ability to have the institutional tools to protect our interests, to advance our interests, and have the instruments of aggression, political and otherwise, to challenge those that undermine our humanity. And so LBS, in terms of the particular work that we do, coming from that perspective, we understand that there's both harm reduction work, which is the work to stop the systems that are doing harm to Black people. So when we look at issues like police brutality, right, which is an issue that LBS has been working on for many years, you'll see mainstream renderings of issues of police brutality revolve around the spectacle of Black suffering and death, and revolve around the notion of Black people petitioning white folks to recognize our humanity. So you'll see on mainstream renderings of conversations about police brutality, conversations about things like banning chokeholds, which is cool. It's something that's a particular policy that can help reduce harm. But it's important that we're clear, and LBS's focus and others' focus has been, how do we put power in the hands of the community to exercise power over the institution of law enforcement, right? So issues like repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, for instance, right? And being able to replace it with community oversight as the mechanism for addressing police brutality is about giving people of African descent, people of color, and just people in general the ability to have the instruments of control over the institutions that do harm to Black people, right? And so whether it's that, whether it's our work on the Black Arts and Entertainment District in West Baltimore, harnessing the cultural and intellectual resources of people of African descent as the basis for building institutions that can allow for the kind of development that is not exploitative and extractive from people of African descent, but in fact generative and built on top of the collective sovereignty that we hope to engender in doing that work. Whether it's our advocacy, we've talked about, the nonprofit industrial complex is a big part of our advocacy. And this, and I'll kind of end on this, which is that a big part of a decision that we made coming out of the Black radical tradition is understanding the history of philanthropy and white progressives generally's attempt to control Black social movements. And so we opted not to be a nonprofit organization and to rather be an LLC for the purpose of being able to exercise maximum autonomy to be able to say the kinds of things I'm saying to you all this evening, right? There are a lot of spaces for whom conversations about white domination and control over many of the institutions that govern Black people's lives is threatening to an environment where there are a bunch of folks, primarily white folks, who benefit professionally, financially, and otherwise off of the suffering, off of profiteering off of the suffering of Black people. So we were clear that being able to speak directly to that dynamic will require for us to have the maximum autonomy to be able to actually advocate the way that has fidelity to our training and socialization. And so I think that's something that when we talk about the relationship between kind of the national, international, national, and state level, I think it's important for folks to be clear that the work to be done for peoples of African descent is about how do we connect the efforts of Black self-determination around the country so that we can stop being so reliant on the Democratic Party, on liberals, on progressives to deliver results for Black people. How do we have a relationship based on leverage as opposed to a relationship that's based on benevolence?
Thank you. And Matt, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us a bit, and then answer that first question.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Matt Hill. I'm an attorney at the Public Justice Center. And I'll be honest, I'm a bit tired of the moment. I just got out of a 2-hour city council hearing. That's why I'm late, ran a little over. I apologize for being late. And now y'all are gonna make me follow Karen and Davon, which is really hard. So that's not cool, but I'm gonna go anyway. So Public Justice Center is part of the nonprofit industrial complex. We are a 501c3 here in Baltimore City, and we do advocacy in the city and the state, and we participate with our partners nationally in various forms of advocacy. We have different teams, different projects. The workplace justice, I know, works closely with Karen on a number of things. We work on healthcare rights. We work on education stability. I'm in the human right to housing team, and we try to choose our teams and our projects based on considerations of economic and racial justice and where we think we can have the most systemic impact. Speaking to the housing piece, we do a combination of individual and class action representation of tenants facing some sort of eviction or predatory practice by their landlords. And our experience in those cases helps inform, to a certain extent, what our policy priorities are. With respect to our policy priorities, we also partner with grassroots organizations to try to determine what they're seeing and work with them to determine what their goals are and how we can help support those goals. So for example, I spent a lot of time working with the Fair Development Roundtable to think about, okay, why is housing so transitory for people? Why are we constantly fighting to keep housing affordable? Why are the decisions around housing so much removed from the hands of renters and other folks in neighborhoods who are impacted by vacants, who are impacted by the fact that their neighbors are moving every year because they can't seem to stay in their homes for many reasons related to race, related to capitalism, and related to our general system and society. And so through a period of study, we worked together and identified an alternative model of housing called a community land trust. And so we worked in partnership with a number of organizations to create the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund through a ballot initiative. Then worked to pass legislation to dedicate revenue to that trust fund, and then worked to make sure that that trust fund actually has dedicated revenue for community land trusts, as well as propping up community land trusts, making sure they have access to the legal and financial resources that they need to be successful. So I'm excited that we're about to really get started on that piece. We have a trust fund. There's about $18 million in the trust fund right now, and $6 million of that initial allocation has been dedicated to community land trusts. And the NOFA, the Notice of Application of Funding Availability, has been issued, and community land trusts are responding, and there's just fantastic plans that are out there. And so we're really excited to be a part of that kind of grassroots to actually building housing that is, I should say what community land trust is. It's a means for permanent affordability of housing that's community controlled. So a typical land trust, the nonprofit land trust, which is controlled by, in part, the community, owns the land and retains ownership of the land. And then they give a 99-year renewable lease to the building owner. Building owner gets a mortgage. They're able to build equity by paying down the principal of that mortgage. And then they also get a little part of the appreciation on the property. And the rest of the appreciation, though, gets reinvested in the property so that the property stays affordable to the next person. And that's what we mean by permanently affordable and community controlled, because the land trust is controlled by residents and community members primarily. So that kind of model is something we're excited about and happy to be a part of. In terms of participating on the state and national level, we try to do the same. We try to work with our partners on the state level, the national level. So for instance, you might have heard HUD is trying to get rid of a really critical part of fair housing law called disparate impact by issuing a regulation that would just completely make it impossible to show, that would make it possible to enforce fair housing law in a lot of cases where it's very clear to us that the primary motivator is race or disability or another protected class. And so working with our partners, we can provide examples from what we're seeing in Baltimore about how disparate impact is really critical to maintain what little fair housing we have. And so working with them to submit those briefs and to make those arguments is a typical part of what we do. I wish we had more time to work on the national stage. And I'm hopeful that with a Biden administration, I know, for instance, the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership Director, Adria Crutchfield, was just appointed to Joe Biden's transition team regarding housing. And Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership does some fantastic work around housing mobility and making sure folks who have vouchers can live in the neighborhood that they want to live in. And so we're really excited. I'm on the board over at BRHP, full disclosure. And that's the kind of ways I think we can also influence the national conversation.
Thanks so much, Karen, Davon, and Matt, for sharing your answers and wisdom with us. In response to that first question, our second question that we have is related to, Davon, your point, the nonprofit industrial complex. So I'm gonna pose a question to you first, and then everyone else can follow with answers afterwards. But basically, social work values and ethics state that we believe as social workers in social justice, service, and dignity and worth of the person. But given these stated values of our profession, how do we navigate our work when the day-to-day micro, meso, and macro actions within the field don't reflect those values? So how do we navigate that? And how do we know what it looks like when the work is reflecting those values?
So a few things. One, I think it'll be important for anybody who works in the field of social work to look at the history of European Christian missionaries and the impact that they had on expanding white supremacy and colonialism, to really understand the contours of the harm that could be done in the name of trying to help people. And I think that's one of the things that I think for many social workers is one of the hardest things to grapple with. which is how is it that a person who may truly be intent on wanting to help people actually create more harm? And one of the ways that that happens is that we live in a society, as I mentioned earlier, one of the outgrowths of a world that is based on European domination of the world. What came along with it was the fundamental degradation of African people as a people, right? The academic discipline of Egyptology emerges during the European Enlightenment for the purpose of theorizing Egypt out of Africa, so that the genealogical connection between African people and the ancient Egyptians were severed in order to further justify the project of enslavement, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera. But that's important also, not just for the kind of political economic part of it, but in terms of our collective consciousness, because many of us have never been exposed to narratives of people of African descent operating in arenas marked as high levels of civilization, right? We may know of individual Black people within European societies that have done amazing things. And I'll give one example. I think it's a very good example. And Ivan Van Sertima's book, Blacks in Science, is a section where he talks about a person in the Museum of Egypt in Cairo, where they found a display case that had an item that they designated as a bird. Someone came and looked at it, and they saw that it wasn't a bird. It was a mechanical contraption. And what they figured out, and it was dated 2,300 years old. And what they did was that they recognized that it was actually an aerial gliding device, dated 2,300 years before they found it in 1898. And so, but they put it in the place where the birds were, because there was no place in their brain that they could have imagined that peoples of African descent were able to conjure up that level of technological expertise that's considered something unique to modern civilization. So if you translate that in the context of social work, there are many people who've only been exposed to narratives of Black people primarily as disadvantaged, as oppressed, right? And unfortunately, because of that internalization, the solutions then that get offered to address the conditions of Black people are solutions that are rooted in the notion that Black folks require entities and institutions outside of our communities in order to be able to sustain ourselves and uplift ourselves. That you will find that in many social work contexts, traditional social work contexts, that there is not the goal, for instance, of cultivating self-sufficiency or self-determination, right? There isn't an attention put to the way in which the devastation, the psychological devastation of people of African descent, where folks internalize notions of Black inferiority, right, as rational. And in fact, it's important, for the listeners on this call to be clear when we talk about the system of white supremacy, is that given all the propaganda that many of us have been exposed to, the notion of Black inferiority is a rational one, right? And so given that, social workers, and so a person that folks should study, Walter Carter is a civil rights activist from the 60s, right? Very important to Baltimore's history. There's a sister named Rhonda Williams that's done some really extensive work on the work that he did. He was a social worker. And when you look at some of the policies that he advocated for, particularly the community action programs, right, and anti-poverty programs, where he advocated that they were resident-led and that the boards that constituted those community action programs were led by residents in their own communities. And so I would say, for social workers, in terms of, so two things. Social workers should, in their current context, subject themselves to a re-education, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the traditional social work literature, training, and socialization is rooted in white supremacy. And so there's an entire body of work that if you're serious and really want to reverse it, to expose yourself to, and I can, put a few in the chat. But secondly, what I would do is look for efforts in the community that it is clear that folks of African descent are doing self-determined work, where they're using narratives and stories that are rooted in the community's ability to shape its own image and to be able to do for itself and be self-sufficient. And when you find those efforts, what you will find is you will find partnerships that will allow you to leverage whatever resources you have to contribute to those efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that everyone would probably really appreciate if you did have those resources. But that was, yeah, that was amazing. Is anyone, I guess, Karen, you want to follow that?
Sure. I mean, listen, Davon stated it very eloquently. There's not much to add, but I do want to add 2 points. And these 2 points really reflect, they may or may not get to the question at hand. I don't know. But these are what I find my frustrations with, I guess, what you could call social work values, social work ethics, the social work in general. You know, over the years, I've just found that the mentality of social work has really, you know, to Davon's point, but to take it a step further, to really like a help the babies mentality. And for my particular work at JOTF, you know, our focus tends to be on adult workers, those who, you know, are older individuals, but they are still struggling, and they have been for some time. Many times when I served as, you know, a policy advocate, a lobbyist, and I, you know, would go around to try to solicit support for many of our policy initiatives before different social work classes or different groups and the like, I would find that there was just this lack of sympathy for older individuals. And it was like, we just need to focus on Jimmy. If we focus on the little babies, then that'll fix everything. But it's like, how are we going to fix this if mommy and daddy or auntie and grandma and like the whole family is messed up, right? Again, messed up due to intentional policies. And we're just trying to throw baby programs at them. And so one of my frustration has just been this reluctance, this apprehension around, you know, providing what folks like to say second chances to adults that messed up, and now we, you know, just they've messed it up for the children now, and now we just need to focus on the children because they're the future. This is not to say that the children are not the future. Of course, children are the future, but there are still people like living today that, you know, are active participants in the lives of these individuals. And so, you know, it boggles my mind that in many spaces, social work is not really viewed as a holistic approach. And it's very targeted in terms of where the care and advocacy falls. My second point actually focuses around what I find is a disconnect many times when it comes to social work and advocacy. I think that there's a, you know, a level of advocacy that, you know, might be done in terms of within your own spaces. And, you know, there may be an opportunity in your class to go testify somewhere or the like, you know, I get it. We all had that when we were in school. Not to downplay it, but I mean, that's pretty much like the extent of advocacy and, you know, policy involvement for individuals who are matriculating through, you know, their studies or profession in social work. And it just boggles my mind how individuals can be in the space of social work and not recognize or understand the impact and the implications of policy, and understand it in a way where, you know, I think a lot of times folks go into the profession because they want it to feel good. And you can say this about a lot of professions, right? You want to go in, I want to go in and do like service related work. And I want to, at the end of the day, I want to feel good and feel like I helped someone. And I went into social work and I went in and, you know, oh my goodness, it's like everyone, they're homeless and they're hungry and they keep going to jail and they're all Black and like, I got to do something. And, you know, that can come across quite offensive because, you know, for individuals like that, many times they're looking for, again, that feel good at the end of the day. This is not feel good work. This is not work that's going to be quick. We're talking about policies that have been in place for a very long time and structures that continue to be prominent and arguably permanent because of these policies and because of the money and the profit that is attached to these structures and systems and policies. And so, I mean, again, like, you know, I think Davon stated very eloquently, you know, the challenges of aligning or reconciling the values and the ethics of social work with the actual, you know, practicalities and functionalities of it. My frustration really falls on, you know, who do we help? Or like, I even remember one time in my own office, we had a intern, a social work intern. I haven't had one since. But, this intern, I remember, so, we focus a lot on criminal record expungement. And yes, cost is a barrier to individuals being able to expunge their record. So here you are trying to expunge your record so you can get a job, get into housing, Matt knows what I'm talking about, all these different things, right? But yet you have to pay in order to expunge your record. It could even be a non-conviction, you weren't even found guilty. So these are individuals who, I need this to move to plan A, B to Z, but this $30 or $50 is preventing me from doing it. Okay, bet. While we are advocating to actually change the law so people don't got to pay for these types of things, and it's just like a thing, we're going to provide the immediate kind of stopgap, these supports of, okay, we're going to do free expungement clinics where, in addition to you being able to get your record expunged for free, you also have access to an attorney, which is a luxury for many individuals. Let's be very clear. Access to an attorney where you can talk about a whole host of things. Even though you're there for expungement, it may go into a whole host of things, right? I remember this intern questioning us and saying, oh my goodness. He asked whether or not providing free expungement services created a state of dependency for low-income Black workers. Now, even though he left the organization the following week, okay, like it just the mindset of, that is the problem, right? And it's very akin to the bootstraps argument, right? That we, tend to only want to use in certain spaces, but it is very real in the social work space. And it boggles my mind how, like, you are about to be a studied professional clinician, right? In this, and you are just, so, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just briefly say I think I can relate to this question in part because legal services, legal advocates often struggle with the same sort of tension and the same issues. And so, like social workers, I think there's a lot of, even the word legal service provider, right? It's like they're offering these wonderful services and wisdom that people should just be thankful to get. And so you find that attitude, and you find this sort of, legal advocate, legal services, we have the money, so we should be, driving the train on what the advocacy should be and how it should proceed. And that's in part because, that's the way the funding is set up in a lot of ways. And it's much easier for my organization, for instance, to get that kind of funding than it is for very smaller grassroots, more radical organizations. And so what can we do about that, I think, is important. And so one thing, it's not easy, don't get me wrong, and I'm not here to preach that it is. But I think it's important for folks in social work spaces, in legal advocacy spaces, to, again, really sit down and have those conversations with folks in the communities that they're working with, and to really, to the greatest extent possible, say, okay, what's your vision? How do you want to get there? And how can I help? And oftentimes that leads me into these very strange spaces where I'm talking to funders and saying, don't fund us, fund this other group, right? Fund these guys who are doing some really phenomenal organizing work of mostly Black and brown tenants over in Bolton Hill, because that's what we need right now. We need a strong Black-led organizing movement around housing justice in Baltimore City. And so spending time really cultivating those relationships, and then using your relationships with funders, if you have them, to then make those connections and hopefully get Black and brown communities the resources they need to actually effectuate that, because that's ultimately what this is about.
Thank you for those varied perspectives. Me and Nita aren't talking much because we talk all day at the School of Social Work. And the direct instructions / the direct call outs that you guys are making are giving me all the life. Thank you so much. I can't wait to show this to all of my peers. And these comments to support all of the work as the chair of these committees, to say these are the things that are necessary to be teaching me and my peers while we're here, so we don't perpetuate these things that I read a paper that said we were trying not to perpetuate. So thank you so much. We have, as you saw it in the chat, there will be Q&A, and that's coming up soon. We'll ask one more moderated question, and then we'll move on to the questions that the audience is asking. So please, if you have any questions, put those in the Q&A. And we see that some people made a couple comments in the chat. We'll also incorporate those into our Q&A. So for our last moderated question, we want to ask, my phone is my Post-it note because it's 2020. James Baldwin wrote, "We disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and the right to exist." When you're organizing, and a lot of you have spoke to this already, but when you're organizing, how do you deal with that reality of that quote? And who are you organizing with? What is your audience? And what factors do you consider when working with who you work with or how you do your work?
So, and I don't even know if I should be the first one to answer this because I'm going to take a different approach to the question. Please forgive me, but throughout, I would say for the past 2 to 3 months, I have heard that quote used so many times. And it's been used in so many different spaces. And, of course, the idea is that that quote is, supposed to make sure that we're thinking about or recognizing the fact that we have differences, but, everything that the quote says, right? It's really, really straightforward. But, besides the fact that I kind of, just, it's almost like, on like MLK or certain days when there's like recycling of like, certain quotes, you're like, there are some other quotes that could actually speak to what we're talking about, or more specific, what, I do or am doing. And so what I would like to do is actually offer another James Baldwin quote that speaks to that question. So this, there's a debate that James Baldwin participated in with William Buckley. And I quote pieces of this debate a lot. And so there is, I'm going to read the quote that Baldwin actually ends his argument on. "Until the moment comes when we, the Americans, are able to accept the fact that my ancestors are both Black and white, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity, that we need each other, that I am not a ward of America, I am not an object of missionary charity, I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment comes, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream." The title of that debate was, "Is the American Dream at the Expense of the American Negro?" And Baldwin's point, he made a number of points, but I think for purposes of this conversation, I wanted to use that particular quote from that particular debate because, there was a piece of the question that I didn't quite understand. And that piece of the question was, how do we build alliance between oppressed people on both sides of the divide to work together? And, a lot of times I think that, especially lately, we are very focused on how to bring everyone together, as we should. Unity, 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 right? How do we bring everyone together? How do we acknowledge, the different challenges on each side? And that acknowledgement is supposed to be a beautiful thing that brings us together for, the benefit of the people. But in acknowledging the differences that we tend to acknowledge for certain folks, Black folks, tend to be this idea of you being a ward of the state, right? Your differences are not the result of, again, intentional policies or intentional actions, but it's just you need more services. We need more programs in your community. Instead of, we should either put new laws on the books or make sure that we're eliminating many of these policies that allow individuals to be viewed as wards and unable to access this idea of the American dream, which is a whole other webinar that we can discuss. And so when, and looking at many of the questions about, who's my audience and what are my strategic decisions, and trying to bring folks together around a policy initiative, my audience is everyone. My audience, of course, are policymakers on both sides of the aisle. My audience is the individuals, just the general public, who many times are unaware of how things work. They may be aware of a consequence or an outcome, but they're not really sure how it works, right? And so, an example of that was bail reform that Davon and I worked on very closely in 2017. This idea that, we had laws and policies that were allowing folks to be locked up simply because they were poor and couldn't pay a cash bail, and those folks were overwhelmingly Black. Everybody was clear about bail, right? But nobody actually knew how the process worked. And so we had to spend a lot of time on both sides of the aisle, right? Both sides of the aisle, political party, but also race, right? Of trying to get folks understand this is the system and this is the impact that it's having on the very communities that you're claiming you're trying to protect. And so our audience is everyone. Our decisions, our strategic decisions, really depend on the policy issue and or the policy journey, right? Matt mentioned protected classes, right? And how does this organization and others ensure that they are supporting those policies or putting policies on the book to protect those protected classes? And what we find is that we end up having to advocate on behalf of those folks that are not protected classes, right? I know that race is a protected class, but what we find are race neutral policies, right? And what these race neutral policies do is it gets at what is no longer legal, right? Allowable, but legal, so to say, right? And so, many times when we are trying to figure out how to bring audiences together and what are the strategic decisions that we can make to make sure that folks, understand, look, policy is a world of negotiation. You're going to have to bring folks together to be able to get to the other side, but there also has to be a point where you have some non-negotiables and you're really clear about who you're advocating for and why. We have to, many times stop trying to normalize the equalization of oppression, right? I'm not saying we need to do oppression Olympics, but, I just feel like we are so focused on trying to equalize oppression. Like your struggle is the same as my struggle. No, it's not, right? And that is okay. And let's be clear about how your struggle is different and then figure out how to craft and advance the solution that will be best for all and not just good for you, but we will say that eventually it might help me and my folks later on down the line. And so, again, policy reform, it's not easy work. It's not something that you can just address and be successful with by having, a bunch of quotes about unity. Policy, any real policy reform should show you that, right? Like you can't, have decades of, devastating policies and then think that you can, have a quote and a nice coalition and you're going to be able to get it knocked out like that. If you're not really clear and have your non-negotiables and be very centered in what it is that you believe and what you're trying to accomplish. And many times a centering ideal or theme of that is folks can advocate on behalf of themselves if they're equipped with the tools. And Davon speaks about this a lot. Equipped with the tools and have the infrastructure that allows them to advocate on behalf of themselves and create the infrastructure that's needed to advance successful reform. And so, without all of that, we're going to continue to advocate within a policy dynamic where we're advocating on behalf of the wards of color of state.
So quickly on that, I'm going to say two things. The first actually is more related to something Karen mentioned, just about how certain quotes get recycled and used a lot. And I think the quote is a good, starting point for conversation. I want to just lift up the fact that we're increasingly moving to a society because of social media that I think has fundamentally shifted a lot of the way that people cognitively experience the world. And so we've moved from content mastery to object manipulation. And so what we're losing, I think, in our contemporary moment is the importance of like deep reading and deep mastery of content. And that's important because the second piece, the second thing I want to say that goes more directly to the question. The current moment and conversations about race and oppression and gender and all that, part of the issue is that people have been using very shallow analyses of oppression and domination, reduced it to markers of identity, and then make political decisions based on very, self-interested, narrow, and neoliberal notions of identity. And what that does is that then politics then becomes about how to make it so that people, quote unquote, feel safe or feel affirmed or feel recognized. Those are things that like in interpersonal interactions are important and make sense. But when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about actually changing the structures of the society we live in, being a person of African descent, and let me actually say this a little differently. What often happens is that disadvantage gets read into who a person is in conversation. And I see a lot of like progressives, falling all over themselves to like make sure that Davon's not offended. Does he feel heard? I don't want to push back against it because I don't want to be racist. And the issue with that, as a person rooted in kind of the Pan-African nationalist perspective and tradition, I don't need anybody to do me no favors, right? That the rigor of the work that I'm doing is work that can be demonstrated by evidence, by empirics, by the work that's done in the community, right? And so to the question about like, in terms of coming together, we don't, all the kind of sentimentality around unity and all the sentimentality about people being each other's friends and standing together and holding hands, that is the kind of rhetoric that misses the point, which is as a people, do people of African descent have the things necessary to sustain a quality life? That is the fundamental question. And that is the basis of any question when we're talking about systems of domination as it relates to Black people. That is the question. That should be our electoral question, right? What was the impact of Barack Obama being president of the United States on the masses of Black people, right? What may be the impact of Kamala Harris being vice president on the collective of Black people? That's a conversation to be had outside of the confines of people's particularized identities, right? And that it should be taken into consideration, but not reduced purely to people's identities. And the last thing I'll say on that is this, right? Some people read, for instance, the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, their meetings with the Ku Klux Klan in the South as a converging of worldviews. What a lot of people don't know is that in the South, there were confrontations that would happen between the Klan and the UNIA. So a big part of when they met wasn't about coming together, right? Like holding hands. They met because they were trying to say, look, when we see you, we be shooting you, you be shooting us. Can we find a way to navigate so that we can fight less? It's in our mutual interest that we shoot at each other less, right? And so for me, that's the basis when I think about this question of like our interests. If I got to talk to someone who's a stone cold Trump supporter as a mechanism for pursuing our collective interests as a people, I have no moral inclination against that, right? Because ultimately the question becomes, can we advance the material conditions of peoples of African descent? That for me for me as I operate and for those who are operating as Black people should be really the basis for how we navigate politics.
So I'll take it from this conversation, we're not all going to join hands virtually and sing on Eagle's Wings, which is too bad. I was really looking forward to that. I took a different stab because I've seen this quote a lot recently too, and I was thinking about it, right post-election, and To get all religious on you for a moment, I also had the meditations on the last words of Christ there, and it was the Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And I think when I see these, it struck home because I have family, I have friends. I'm from Alabama, and they support ideas and people that are racist, and support white nationalism. And I have a very hard time, reconciling myself to those relationships and their ideas and their approaches that I can't handle. And I don't know how to handle it, frankly. I'm not an expert on that in any way. And then I think, I forget who said it. I think somebody was talking about I think it was Dave, on the ecosystem of media and the way it's manipulated. And it is. I mean, these folks are just bombarded by Fox News and much worse. And that's their frame of reference, not to excuse it. But, then the question becomes, well, how do you change that frame of reference? And how do you connect to people? And how do you persuade them? Which I think Karen was talking about a little bit. And that's important. And that's part of the craft of advocacy and policy. And that's what we do all the time. But what I've appreciated and come to learn over the past just 5 or 6 years is there's persuasion and then there's power. And frankly, it's so much more rewarding and meaningful to work with people who want to build power. And so working with some of these organizers around a more radical analysis and how do we take power, both political power and electoral power, and then translate that into things that are actually going to help people in a very real way to elevate themselves and to raise up their own lives and to take control has been very rewarding. And so I think persuasion is an important piece of things, but ultimately, kind of as Devon was getting at, it is about power. And so to the extent you can have those, kind of as I was talking before, to me, it starts with the slow, unproductive conversations that aren't going to accomplish your task lists or help you with your grant report, but that are so critical to forming the kinds of partnerships that you can work with to help take power and to be part of that.
Thank you all for answering those questions. We're going to take the next few minutes to jump into some Q&A questions from the audience. Let me pull up the first one.
While she does that, I'm just going to shout y'all out. Somebody, he looked at the chat, said, can we get these speakers to teach classes? Working on it, y'all. I'm going to just say, social work is kind of cheating, y'all. I had Karen and Davon in my classes. So, raise a fuss.
Okay, so let me pull up which one we should start with first.
Can I make a point while, I want to piggyback on something that Matt said while you are finding the questions. I think it's challenging a lot for, folks to understand how to reconcile someone who's like blatantly, racist, homophobic, like all of these things, right? It's difficult to understand how you can work with them on something. Totally get that. But I think there are a number of examples of how that has been done, right? And it's being done. And how I think it's many times it is Trump the person that I think, makes it difficult for folks to recognize that it's been done and it's being done. So criminal justice reform, right? Like this really only became a hot issue a couple of years ago. It had always been a hot issue for folks that were already doing the work and impacted by it and the like. But a couple of years ago, it started to become a really hot issue. And the reason why is because conservatives took it on. Conservatives took on criminal justice reform as something that they wanted to focus on, something that they wanted to lead on. And this is something that the Democrats, given their platforms and missions and the like, they should have been leading on massive criminal justice reform, but we're not. And so in place, you have the conservatives step in and all of a sudden we're advocating for the advancement of certain criminal justice reform policies. they didn't care about who was necessarily being impacted. They weren't like leading on it for like racial justice issues. It was simply fiscal reasons. It didn't have anything to do with race. But they used race as a way to uplift them as the leaders of criminal justice reform and challenge the Democratic Party in a way where it's like, look, we're doing what you shouldn't be doing. And I say they uplift race, not that they actually uplifted race, they identified Black faces to join them on stage and to help advance many of their efforts without actually speaking about the racial piece. And so you would find that, you know, you would be in spaces with conservatives and their folks, and they're talking about criminal justice reform and the impact of it on behalf of Black and brown folks. But then when you have those folks that have kind of already been in that space to a certain level or to a certain extent and are now like, great, this is an opportunity to like really, really talk about it. And you're ready to talk about it. And they're like, whoa, wait, we can't jeopardize this unity for issues that we know exists, but we got unity right now. So we need to stick with the unity. And if race is going to jeopardize unity, we're going to have to kick race off the table. Just focus on the fiscal part to keep the unity. And so I think I wanted to raise that because, you know, there are instances where it's being done. It's just, how do you make sure that you are clear? To Dave on one, how do you make sure that you're clear about why you're at the table and continuing to advance that even when you're at the table with people who you may not agree with?
Thank you. Yeah. So our first question from the attendees is, as we celebrate our new vice president and all that her election signifies, how do we celebrate this while also keeping in mind her controversial history, specifically as the California Attorney General?
So I'll take the first stab at that, and then I actually have to go shortly afterwards. So again, just want to say I appreciate the opportunity to engage the School of Social Work and look forward to many more engagements. To that question, let me say a few things that I think are helpful. I think the first is that we have to ask ourselves real questions about the role of representation. And while most people are used to representation, and I'm talking about Black representation in certain mainstream aspects of society, many of us have understood that inherently as progress. And I want to challenge people to think of Black representation as a perfection of the system of white supremacy, right? So when we look at, you know, projects of colonialism around the world, right, we have to look at the fact that it has been Black folks who, one of the things John Henrik Clarke once said is that there was not a African state or an African head of state on the continent that was using indigenous forms of governance to run their respective nations, right? That they were using the tools and instruments of European, you know, nation states to operate their communities in a context where culturally it was a mismatch. And so many African heads of states have pretty much functioned as extensions of the project of European domination of the world. And that extends, you know, here into the United States, where unfortunately, you know, Black elected officials at all levels have been in many respects used as mascots for white corporate power over Black people's lives. And so we have to be clear that that's a dynamic, regardless of who the person is. Because I think sometimes we get sucked into the personality, like what does it say about them as a person? And we have to look at this structurally, right? Now, having Black people in those positions can be useful if we leverage them. And so I understand people's desire to celebrate, you know, Kamala Harris being VP. You know, I think people are entitled to celebrate that, you know, to whatever extent they're interested in. If we're seriously talking about policy, we have to be prepared to ask ourselves, what are we going to need to do to extract from Kamala Harris and the Biden administration the things that our community needs? And again, that's the only metric we should be using to evaluate the legacy of these people who are holding these offices, not based on the feeling we get from watching them ascend to those levels, you know, of power. And I just think, and I think too often we have to be careful what we tell young people, because I think we often tell young people, be like that. And we have to ask ourselves the question. One of the things I quoted Ivan Van Sertima earlier, one of the things that he's known for saying is that the biggest fools aren't the ones that graduate, are the ones that don't graduate school. A lot of the biggest fools are the ones that do. You know what I mean? And so I think we have to be careful about who we point to as our exemplars and look for other exemplars. You know, what about people like Assata Shakur? You know what I'm saying? You know, what are other exemplars? You know, we should learn about Yaya Santiwa. You know what I'm saying? Mariah Stewart. You know, we should point to exemplars that are more in line with the kind of success that is rooted in our collective liberation, as opposed to people getting their own individual professional accolades. So I'll leave it at that. Again, I'm sorry I have to run. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this evening. Look forward to more engagements in the future. You all take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Say, Matt or Karen, do you want to get on that question? About to say, Matt, for real, I'm not laying. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I have nothing to add to Davon's point. He stated it perfectly.
Yes, thank you. Nina, you can go ahead and go with the next question. I'm processing.
Okay. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. Given the understandable mistrust and the very real possibility of harm that you all were sharing today, what are your suggestions for creating partnerships for white people and Black and Brown people?
I'm gonna add to that, like, white people and Black and Brown people, right? But like, let's expand that to include people of varying identities to organize around, you know, things that they want to change. Like, let me not change that person question. Race is important.
But could you state it again? Could you make sure I heard it correctly?
The question here, I can also copy and paste it into the chat. Given the understandable mistrust and very real possibility of harm, what are suggestions for creating partnerships for white people and for Black and Brown people? Was the question.
If I'm being completely honest, I am someone who I never speak to something I don't feel comfortable speaking to, or I feel that it's going to be too much of my own opinion and less, you know, fact and actual experience. I mean, quite honestly, this is something that I struggle with. And I don't know if this is the question, but I take it as figuring out how to, you know, work with white allies. And that is something I struggle with because, you know, a lot of times I'm having to constantly remind folks that we are not a monolith. And so in this rush to be allies and to create partnerships, many times we erase what makes us different. And we minimize, you know, what the real issues are. I find this a lot when it comes to issues that are quote unquote gender specific. You know, there could be an issue that, yes, this is something that speaks, you know, mostly to the traditional form of, you know, an individual who identifies as a woman, right? There is this idea that any and everyone, regardless of race, age, location, like all of that, right? Sexual orientation, the like, right? That you are going to rock hard with this particular policy initiative because we are a monolith, right? Women power, girl power, like all of that. And it's like, no, that's, especially now, like that's just not the case, right? Our challenges are not the same. And so, you know, in an effort to be allies, it's like, yeah, no, but we just, you know, this is an issue on behalf of like all of us. And then once we get over the hump, then we can talk about like how it actually impacts other individuals. And it's like, no, if we're not thinking about that on the front end, then the solution, the actual policy reform, won't reflect that. And those conversations, just wanting to be very intentional about how the reform is being crafted, which in turn will reflect what your partnership looks like, that is contentious in and of itself, because you know, they're even using the example of criminal justice reform. I have had way too many conversations with white judges, both male and female, who believe that they should have the same access to our coalition tables because they adjudicated over a ton of cases, a ton of Black and brown bodies. And so because they've been sitting on the bench for so long, and they've, you know, gotten to a point where they're like, this is so messed up, and, you know, I want to do something, like, I belong at this table and I should be the one who's negotiating, quite honestly, on behalf of all of you, because I know the law, I'm a judge. Like, it's a huge issue of how do you ensure that allyship is a thing that folks actually really believe in. And it's something that for many advocates, Black and brown advocates, we have struggled with for some time, and we are especially struggling with it right now. For some reason, it's like there is this huge effort to, you know, show, particularly, you know, Black and brown folks that have been doing the work of advocacy and the like, that you're super, super woke, or, you know, you get it, or you're down. And it's like, if you use those words, I know you're not. If you don't have a body of work or track record to show me that, you know, you understand, you know, what's being done, what's trying to happen, and using the same language that we're using, then no, I don't believe that you belong at the same negotiating tables with me. I don't believe you should have the same access as those individuals who are directly impacted through whatever experience and the like. But, you know, that tends to be frowned upon in the spirit of, again, you know, unity or allyship. So I guess the only suggestion that, you know, I would have is you know, something that Davon suggested earlier. And it's just for those who are seeking to be white allies and creating those partnerships, to really subject themselves to those institutions and those examples, and like really subject yourself, not just like attend a meeting and be like, oh my goodness, that's cute, and then like show up at the next meeting and still trying to push her. I think you guys should do this. Like really show a point of trying to really understand, and then supporting that model without trying to supplant that with a model that you believe works better for those individuals who have been very clear about what it is that they want for themselves and their communities. So I don't know if that really answered the question. I just wanted to articulate the struggle that we have as advocates in trying to figure out what that looks like.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think, you know, in some ways what Karen said, it boils down to, from the white person perspective, at least, you know, listening and real dialogue and maintaining that over a very long period of time, and you know, subjecting yourself, making it clear that you're there to be a real partner and not dominate the agenda. And that's you know, that's the start. And I think too, working, as I said before, to get resources, the foundation money, the government money, to the organizations that are led by Black and brown folks who are doing the on the ground organizing work is another way to do that.
Thank you for adding that piece, Matt. And we got the great soon-to-be Dr. Shawnee Brown in the chat, lifting up some important words, and that's moving from allyship to being an accomplice. And in my experience in the social work, it would be so nice. Like, I would say I have a lot of peers that are accomplices, but I don't have a lot of people to look up to that are accomplices. And it's starting to, which is a beautiful thing, right? But I think that's really important to lift up and speak to. Also, what we will try to do is everybody who says something in the chat will, Dr. Shadama and myself will try to collect the questions and make sure you guys get some responses. And these conversations are happening every day at School of Social Work, y'all. So like, join the spaces where these conversations are happening. People mention what curricula should be like. I know AOWG and the Alliance and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion are actively working to help people in the university understand that we have to do the work that you're saying in the chat should be happening. So in whatever ways y'all can assist, send an email, actually make a phone, like let it join the good fight at the School of Social Work, because actively I joined the fight, and that's why it's still happening. So come be part of the conversation, because it's not even like we getting told no more. So it's not like hypothetical. It's like let's do this work that makes our school this place. Yeah. So back to the Q&A for our last question.
Yeah.
I think this is really important, because we kind of like, social workers are like low-key self-loathing. Like we dog ourselves, but we know we're trying to do right, but we still dogging ourselves because we're trying to do better, but we dogging ourselves. So like, what are some recommendations that you have for social workers, or really anyone who's doing this type of work, who feels burned out and discouraged at the very incremental process, like resulting from years and years of this hard work? I want to say Ashe to Dr. Richards. She was one of the people who, when I was being all idealistic and saying, oh, well, no, she was bringing me down, like bringing me back to where the conversation needed to be. So thank you for, I actually prayed to the ancestors today. That's crazy that we got a new one. But I think she really embodied this. So like, what do we do? What recommendations do you have to give to the people who are discouraged by burnout, or just the process of dealing with this stuff, like doing this work year after year?
Yeah. So this, kind of goes back to some points that I made earlier. Everyone wants to work in a job, in a profession where they feel good about what they're doing. But if you get into policy work or advocacy, because you believe that it's going to be a quick fix, or it's not going to be for the long run, then you won't enjoy it. You will get burned out. I like to say that those that are like actively breathing and living advocacy and policy reform, that it's both the art and a science, right? It's a science because you got to know the law, you have to be able to know the process, like all of that. But it is an art because you have to be able to be in it for the long run. Okay, like whenever I'm doing like my legislative 101 type things, I let folks know that for the bills, for the pieces of legislation that's really going to have like some impact, like really you're going to see like, some seismic shifts. That thing is going to take a couple years to pass, because it's going to require the first 2 years or the first couple of years, you're just educating folks on the issue, right? Even thinking about bail reform. Bail reform just didn't happen in 2017. Those arguments started in like 1972, in Maryland at least. That's the history of bail reform in Maryland, right? First conversation started in 72. And it wasn't until there was like a lot of national momentum and the like around it that folks really wanted to, actually do something about it. And we're still having to like deal with it, right? That's why we got a community bail fund, because folks still being locked up for unaffordable cash bails. But the idea that you're going to have to be in it for the long run, because you're going to have to educate folks for a long time, then you're going to have to agree on legislation that's going to take a long time, then you got to get the thing passed, getting all different types of, positions and personalities to agree and then implement. So, I mean, it is for the long run. And the idea of being burned out, I get it. Let's be clear. I get it. Maryland is unique in that we have a 90-day session. So 90 days, the General Assembly is considering, over 3,600 pieces of legislation, give or take. And we are very active. We have our own policy agenda, plus are working on other things. We either got to kill people's bad bills or support other bills. And so the fact that we do this every year in 90 days and like still go back, you have to actually like this work. You have to be able to understand that it's in it for the long run. You have to be able to understand that, at the end of this 90 days, you put everything into it and you still might not see anything, but you have to keep going back. You got to keep going back, because at the end of the day, if you aren't going back, who is there that is advocating and pushing on behalf of folks? Because Annapolis, our state capital, is purposely inaccessible for folks. And so it's not like legislators are going back and trying to figure out how to actively engage their folks and their initiatives. And so it is our responsibility to make sure that we are educating policymakers, but also educating our community members and neighbors about what's going on and how they can be involved. And that's a lot of work, and you're going to get burned out because you're going to get told no, and nobody's going to have any real explanation. And, you know, folks who you think are allies, you know, are going to end up being on the opposite side and all of these things. And so I think that, you know, in order to avoid burnout, you have to have some really like hard, you know, conversations with yourself and just do like some inner soul searching to, you know, ask like, you know, why are you in this work? And if you're really in it for real policy reform, then you will understand that it's going to take a bit to be able to change some of these policies and practices that, again, have intentionally been in place for decades. And so it's, you know, a couple of advocates isn't just going to be able to, you know, show folks the light, especially when there are folks who may very well be profiting off of the very systems that we're trying to overturn and overhaul. So I know that wasn't like the, you know, drink your milk and go to Annapolis and rock on. I've got that for you. And you'll never get that from anyone who does like real policy reform and advocacy. Like it's hard work. And it's why, you know, only certain folks can and should do it.
I agree with Karen. I don't have a lot to add. I think that, you know, people talk a lot about self-care, and it's true in some ways. You do have to have some self-care, and I've learned that very quickly. Actually, no, I didn't learn it quickly. I learned it very recently, like the past 2 years, because every time I was working a weekend, I was working on nights, and it was not sustainable. And I did burn out for a bit. And I think you know, exercise, meditation, eating better, but you know, anchoring yourself is a big part of it too, and realizing where you're anchored, both inside the work and outside the work, and where is your anchor outside the work, and in terms of who you are and what you believe, because the work is always going to be there. To Karen's point, I was just recently we passed a bill that it started in 1998, I think, called the Home Act, trying to prohibit source of income discrimination in Maryland. And, you know, I was working on it probably for 5 or 6 years, and there were folks working on it before me for a very long time. And it simply just was about the fact that, you know, we have a Fair Housing Act in Maryland, says you can't discriminate as a landlord based on race, gender, sexual orientation, a number of other protected classes. And we want to add source of income there, because what happens is folks with vouchers are not allowed to rent by landlords in more wealthy, wider neighborhoods. And we know what this is really about, right? I mean, it's about race. Going back to these kind of racially neutral policies, in a way, there's also class in there too. But it's at least in part about race in a lot of jurisdictions. But to an earlier point, we couldn't talk about race, frankly, as much earlier in the advocacy. And it was only with the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement that we were able to actually start talking about race in this context again, and actually get the bill passed, I think. My point being that it was incredibly frustrating and painful and slow, and you know, put my heart into it and got knocked down year after year. And so watching it get passed was fantastic. And then you realize, oh wait, that's just this tiny little piece of a little more justice in the world, and we still have so much more to do. So I think it's about anchoring yourself, I guess, is my final answer.
Thank you for that answer. We have about 3 or 4 minutes, 3 minutes left on the clock. And I see a really important question in the chat. And I kind of wanted to speak. The question, Shauna Murray Brown posed a question of what would it mean to center the needs of Black folks to address anti-Blackness instead of conflating it with other oppressions? And I think that's important to say out loud, because Baltimore City is a city that's majority Black. And it's just the truth that when we are trained in the School of Social Work, we are trained to work with Black and brown people. And even though we won't be able to unpack that, I wanted to say it out loud for the 100 people, right, that are on this call right now. What would it mean to center the needs of Black folks and address anti-Blackness instead of conflating it with other people's oppression. So when you're in school and we say, well, something about Blackness, to not say, but what about the anybody else? Because we work with Black people. So if you can't center somebody, you really got to question yourself. How are we human centered and healing centered and focus on the individual person if we can't center someone, a main part of somebody's identity. Wow, you guys, thank you so much. This is great. We do have, like Dr. Shadma said at the beginning, we have one more lecture in this series. And if you like this style of series, let us know. The Thursz lecture happens every year. And this is the first time we've made it a 3-series event. So keep coming back. School of Social Work is having a ton of events like this. Anybody else say anything?
Thank you.
Dr. Shadma, handing it off to you.
Can't hear you.
I think she's just saying good night. I think that's why she's not taking it off.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Mary Jalil and to Nina for your facilitating, and thanks to Karen and Matt and to Davon who had to pop off. But we really appreciate you sharing your wisdom, including when with the things that you were struggling with as well. So thank you.
Thank you for having us, and City forever and ever. Represent MJ.
And if you don't know and you hear, that's a problem, right? If you don't know what we're talking about and you work in Baltimore City, that's a problem. Train yourself up on our cultural norms, please.
Just become friends with Karen on Facebook. You'll get a lot of city love there.
Can't figure out like that. Poly Pride. We know we all make simple decisions, but it's a great institution. So
delete them. Okay, time to go. Louise, Poly Pride.
Go to class.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Can I make one quick announcement? If you are looking for CEUs, the same registration site that you went to get the link, the Zoom link, go back there to fill out the evaluation. And then your CEU certificate, you'll be able to download. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. All right, y'all. Peace. Be safe.